Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change. And like always in this podcast, it's about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. I'm very grateful to spend this precious time and space together in this room with Alessa Berg. In my own understanding, how I make sense of you, Alessa, is you're a polymath. You wear many hats, but you've been working a lot in the last years in what some people would coin like ethical investment or impact investing. So before we start diving into the weeds of impact investing and why we think that's a lever, as we know money makes the world go round, I'm curious on the human being. Alessa, like what gets you up in the morning? What lets your eyes shine? And why do you then think that your involvement with, let's say, the big money machine, the mega machine, as some people call it, makes all the difference? Yeah, so really just curious to show more of Alessa. What sparked your interest in the whole topic?
Thank you, Alistair, for this question. And it's great to be here with you today, covering the kind of topics that I spent lots of time on to answer your question. I love connecting dots in unusual ways. And connecting dots in unusual ways, I think at this point in time on our planet and on the path we are on, is extremely valuable for our evolution. Because as you know, innovation happens at the fringes, at the cutting edge of where we're generally at. And in our hyper-connected world, in our advanced world, creating value in ways that might be unexpected, counterintuitive, polymathic, as you were saying, bringing together different fields. We do have recent examples of this. Crypto and blockchain technology itself are an example. And so are a few different eras. I think that even companies that have defined the last decade or two, such as Apple, bringing together beautiful design with hardware and other components that used to be siloed as hardware is not looking good, and that's not the point. So, but there is so much more to be done, right? We're just scratching the surface of that. For me personally, when I reflect about why is this something that I like doing and I'm good at doing, and I kind of represent that, I am Swiss Brazilian. I have two very different sides in me. And I also have, in a way, in my skills, from having started my career in M&A, Goldman Sachs and private equity at Blackstone, but then having covered other completely different areas of entrepreneurship or the arts and completely different words that I do feel naturally come together at this point in my being, in the way that I live my life, and then also in the way that I show up through the value that I create through the companies that I build, is extremely sort of like telling of who Alessa is, your question, and then how this manifests into the world. One of our companies, so the company that is taking most of my time right now, ESG 360, is a climate tech startup that has the most diverse founding team you could imagine. Like sometimes we just like the three of us look at each other and we're like, wow, guys, like we're so complementary here. And that's exactly, the formula that was needed for this, and that has made it grow and advance so fast. And yet, it always marvels us. So I don't know if this answers your question, but to me, ultimately, it does come down to bringing completely different fields and completely different points of view together, both because it's who I am, and because eventually I do think that's adding value into the world.
Let's bring a couple of these buzzwords together. So you were mentioning counterintuitive, polymath, and complementarity. Why do you think, especially in, let's say, the state of the world we find ourselves in, this is so important? Because, normally you could say, well, you're an expert in one field, so it's more important to become even like like a deeper an expert in one field. Why do you think it's so important, not only for your endeavors, but especially for those in, like, let's say, impact investing? It's so important to bring like people from like a broad spectrum of, let's say, ontologies and perspectives together.
Yes. So I want to start by saying that both are welcome, needed, and valuable, right? Because sometimes in these discussions, we get polarized. Oh, no, it's like this, or it's like that. And actually, my view, it's both, right? So we need deep vertical expertise, like that's never going to change. Just like we need these connecting the dots and these horizontal sense making. Now, this horizontal sense making, like, why do we need that? Before going into the more sort of like concrete or technical explanation of that, I want to say that it's also on a human level, something that allows us to understand each other. Understanding each other's perspectives in this world, I see as so essential. And I do see us as a civilization going to a point in time where we are no longer saying, this is right and this is wrong in my specific subjective worldview. We are acknowledging and gaining awareness of our own subjective view and how our subjective view relates to other subjective viewpoints, which then all come together to create reality. And so this is extremely important. Why? Because it moves us from disconnection to connection. It moves us from lack of understanding each other to acceptance, right? So I think this plays a very fundamental role just from this point of view. And then the way that it comes in function, in shape, more concretely for the way that we operate is that it's really like building companies that can tackle complexities at scale. So if I think about, what I spend time in, day out, impact and climate, there is so much interconnectedness. Like you may touch A, you think, oh, it's good, we touch A, and then B gets screwed up, and then everybody's running to B, and then what about C? Oh, and then there's D, nobody knew even about D, and the list goes on. So these kind of taking online, not just the data points, but the knowledge areas, and having enough people and enough of a system that can help with the sense making of it, I find very necessarily, especially because of that. And especially because at the end of the day, when we talk about going to the next level of our civilization, I think that next level has a level of, it's not really complexity, because I think at a certain level of consciousness, it all becomes really, really simple. But for where we are now collectively, it does look complex, and we can't assume we know, right? We need to stay very humble and try to gradually get there together.
I wonder if we can take it one level down in the complexity of the conversation, and if you can sketch the ecosystems you're building like now, and almost like backcasting, looking in the rearview mirror and saying, what happened maybe in your personal life, but also triangulating with your professional experience, what ultimately led you to this point in your biography now, and how that interrelates precisely why this grid of building vertical expertise and horizontal sense making is so important for that.
Yeah, so if I backtrack it, really a few years ago, I let go into, hey, what am I naturally interested in? What do I naturally gravitate towards? That also happens to be on what I would consider the critical path of where we're going, and adds value, right, to everybody. And so it was this surrendering, and this surrendering came about through my personal journey, obviously, and working in an integrated way, from plant medicine to how we can just on a day-to-day basis, tap into ourselves and gain awareness of who we are, where we're going, what we are all about. These processes led me more and more to kind of show up in a way that comes natural. And Top Tier Impact was born out of that. Top Tier Impact was never something that was planned in this specific, we're going to do this and that, and this is a network, or this is a community, or this is the investment banking services side. And like, absolutely not. It was completely organic, surfacing from a place of, wow, I see a new paradigm through impact and sustainability that I believe to be more appropriate than the current paradigm of our economy and society for where we're going, or rather for where I would like things to be going. And so I want to support this paradigm. How do I support this paradigm? Hey, these things come so natural to me, of course, that I can help with connecting the dots in certain ways, and with bringing people faster towards where they want to be going together, either by connecting or either by supporting certain functions that are relevant to what they're doing. So that's really what happened. It also happened in a way that I didn't expect it to be my next business. In a way that you could say is like really just this natural or this play type of approach that makes a lot of sense for me in general. And so it happened with the next things that came up. So for instance, in January Q1 2024, a TV series on Gaia that I was approached to host and create will be premiering. And it's a TV series on all areas of impact, positive impact. So really from consciousness expansion all the way to sustainable communities. And this came out in the exact same way. It was something that, I do love sharing messages that I resonate with. And I have built a presence over time through that sharing online. And I was being asked a lot to do video. But again, I didn't want to do video and long form video if it didn't make sense to me. So I just kept on saying, no, look, I don't have an angle yet that resonates with me. And the moment that angle came out, and it came out in this typical download fashion, the whole thing, the whole concept, the name of the thing, 2 days later, I was approached to do this. And I could say that something similar also happened with the ESG 360, our climate tech platform, SaaS platform that now takes most of my time because it's a typical startup growth journey. And how we got together. I could tell you that story, but I'll just pose it here because, really like what I was saying is sort of this, to summarize the answer is this surrendering to the process that aligns with our skills and what we like to be doing, what we, this kind of ikigai intersection, right? That's really been part of that.
I feel like, because I'm a very visual person, so I feel like I want to give the listeners a story, but also pictures of the ecosystem. So let's start with top tier impact, especially for those that are not so deep into impact investing. What is top tier impact? What was the genesis? Where is it standing? And how would you differentiate top tier impact to other networks of impact investors? I think that's good for the first question before we then start outlining what you're building with ESG 360.
So top tier impact is a place where leaders in the impact space, whether it's investors, founders, professionals, and we have some climate scientists, some artists as well, increasingly so at the moment, come together to exchange stories, exchange value, exchange knowledge. So most recently, we had 2 people meeting each other. They work in the intersection of Web3 and impact, and they became co-founders through TTI. They're both highly experienced and successful in the space. But I guess coming together through us in the last months just made it all happen. So I saw the announcement recently. And so we have these kind of things happening all the time. It's just the recent example I heard a couple of days ago from them. And I miss a lot of them. And so, there's a lot of stories like that. But ultimately, the difference from other networks and the growth of our network, I think, comes down to the fact that TTI was never created to be a network in the impact space. TTI was created to accelerate the mainstream adoption of impact as the way we do business, running companies and investing in companies. It just happens that a way to deliver that, to deliver this acceleration that makes a lot of sense in general, but especially made sense for me, for what I was telling you, has a shape that is basically a network. So the fact that it came from this intention, right? The intention of delivering on that, the intention of going on this mission, the intention of making it happen together, rather than, hey, we're doing a network and this is what's about and so on. I think that's what really differentiates or makes a difference there.
I'm trying to come to grips with what excited you in the journey. And if you were to pick one or two or three verticals, ideally not only one, what are the, I don't like the word success stories or best practice examples. What are the more magical things that are happening in the network? And if you were to pick best practice examples or something like that, what are they? And why especially top tier impact as a network catalyzes the serendipity of things to happen like that?
So I think this is a great moment, Alistair, to branch into the fact that actually not only TTI wasn't born to be a network, but it's not only a network anymore. And I will give you an example that comes from our impact investment banking unit, where we mostly work with development finance institutions, which are the funds of countries all around the world. They are mandated to create impact. So their performance is measured by the level of impact, typically social impact, then other indicators as well. Environmental impact has become more relevant just recently in the last few years, because these were historically social impact related organizations. We have supported with partners as well in bringing these capital into companies across emerging markets, so Africa, Latam, Southeast Asia, that have an impact component, but that are also digital. This capital used to be for infrastructure, physical infrastructure and real estate projects. So we have been doing this, and an example that I can give you that was announced several months ago is that we help facilitate and complete the 90 million euro debt investment into a financial inclusion startup in Africa. It's a large one, obviously, at this point. It's called Wave Mobile Money. And it operates in Senegal as the leader in mobile banking and a few other countries. As you can imagine, obviously, financial inclusion is a big topic in these countries. And this was the largest round of debt ever raised in Africa in history for a tech company. So breaking these records is important, not just for the company itself, but for all the other companies that are coming after them, some of which we are working together with, for these companies to believe that it's possible for them too, because it is, and we're supporting with that. So I think this is an example to give. And to me, it has particular relevance because, of course, there's a lot to do, here, Europe, UK, US, but we often have a gap to bridge also in the understanding of what the relevant issues and dynamics in emerging markets are versus in our markets is quite different.
Can you sketch another example that excites you?
Another example that excites me is, so we organized these policy forums that happened a few years ago and up until last year on topics like green hydrogen, nuclear. We picked them at times where, it was controversial and not even top of mind in the public discussion. We have, I was just told about it last week, and I'm very excited to hear this. We can't fully announce this whole thing yet, but there was a big consortium with lots of capital and innovation around green hydrogen that formed out of this as well. And that's exciting for me because I think that when you get different stakeholders to collaborate on technologies that are a little bit on the cutting edge, so we're not just talking about renewable, but geothermal, fusion, hydrogen, green hydrogen, which at the time when we held this conference was still a little bit I don't want to say obscure, but like there were just so many like little things that were being figured out, and tough to translate as well, even to an audience of investors. And I see how this has changed, and then I see this kind of big partnership that has been coming together form itself, and that's, you know, to me, that's just fantastic. So that's another recent one I heard of.
We're recording this and you will get published as number 39, out of which I had a good dozen of deep conversations with impact investors. Where do you personally differentiate your own personal involvement and what is often flagged by public opinion as greenwashing? Just, you know, just because you raised the word around nuclear, you know, it's a highly controversial topic. I don't feel like we need to touch on nuclear especially, but where do you personally draw a line in between projects you get offered to support and people in the network that are supporting certain causes, and really not wanting to use yourself and your ecosystem that you're building for just ESG fig leafing, greenwashing, I always call it?
So I wish there was a simple answer to go about this, Alistair. And the reality is that the way that we see it and we do it, it isn't that simple. Why? Because, for instance, the way that we go about climate-related financial disclosure, now biodiversity disclosure at ESG 360, the lines and the stages of how this is being done by companies, for instance, like they're numerous, right? So it's really not just like this is good and this is bad. But unfortunately, what I will say is that for the majority of companies, so what's going for me, there are two things that don't work. It's not just let's dress this up for marketing purposes, which is greenwashing, in my opinion, in a summary, in a nutshell, just to appear in a certain way and just be useless in the background and not do the actual work that is required to truly make a difference and to truly implement the changes that are not simple, are not easy, but are required and mandated. So that's one thing. Now, the second thing is more, and this is really where we're operating at with the ESG 360, is more the confusion and the lack of education and, you know, the chaos that comes around how do we implement this transition. Now, I'm going specifically into net zero when I say transition, because that's effectively the process where you can see, okay, these companies truly committing to implementing the hard changes, or this company has not even a clue like when down the line. Now, again, the thing is, this confusion is happening also because whether our company has been proactive or not about all of this and about being serious about sustainability, the regulation has been coming. Now, I'm really not saying that the regulation is the silver bullet and we're all good, right? Because the process of education and learning happens on that side of the fence as well with regulation. Now there's ISSB coming out, which is going to be part of IFRS. So at an global accounting standard level, all of this is going to be implemented and taken into the equation. But what I am seeing there is so much confusion and so much actual work that needs to be done, not just in a specific way through a software platform like ours, but actually across the organization from a coordination perspective and from a communication perspective of different stakeholders having to find ways to communicate with each other and make this change happen. So, you know, the bottom line is, it's not that simple just because there are different parts of it. I think the classic greenwashing is this is for marketing purpose, and when you just lift the veil, like you can see quite easily. So that's where I don't find it too tough, for me to tell like what's real or not. And again, we are in a place where most cases, all of this was treated as related to marketing as opposed to related to I can go into a longer discussion about this, so you tell me if we're going that direction or not, but as supposed to be put in the different buckets where it's going now.
I think we both agree that obviously changing the fundamentals within a company and within a supply chain is ultimately where at least the road towards net zero needs to go. Besides it being, when I started my sustainability, when I started working my career, built up a B2B magazine on sustainability issues 17 years ago, most of these endeavors were usually the guys in the marketing department. And we see how much has also changed. In my opinion, not all of it only for the better, but definitely that companies are becoming way more aware of, let's say, the urgency of the challenges ahead. I feel more like we can't look into a crystal ball, but we're both in the sector for many years. So I wonder, how do you see the sector in general developing? When you look like 3 years, 5 years, 10 years into the future, what changes do you see happening, and what excites you also with playing a role within your ecosystem?
Yeah, it's nice getting this question also with the perspective of you having been in the space for a while, because as you know, a few years ago, everything here was smaller, simpler, but also a bit more confused, perhaps, because what I see, what the main thing that I've been seeing is a lot of expansion just in terms of the sheer number of people being involved in all the specific movements of the impact space. And, we can take climate now as a reference point, right? Because obviously it's it's a big driver here, but also it's become so much more sophisticated. So when I started Top Tier Impact, we could say, hey, impact, right? And there's a few different things going on, and we also help reconcile what impact actually means. But now, even if you zoom into the climate space, the well-being space, there is so much diversity, so much action. And so what I think is going to happen is that just like we have seen several trends going mainstream now, several understandings of, obviously, bringing net zero into all boardrooms, bringing ESG, bringing conversations that are about how and why this has to happen, bringing that into policymaking, like all of this has now happened. And yet, in a way, I still feel like we're scratching the surface, because all of this will become so integrated and basic, so to say, to how we show up in business, right? And that is what I see happening for the next few years. And I don't just see it in this example right now with climate. I see it with well-being, for instance. Like, I think that COVID was such a big push for all conversations around both mental health, but also modalities, from plant modalities to, like norma psychotherapy modalities, like, so to say norma, but like all the range of things that before, 5 years ago plus, like we're just a little bit like on the sidelines in conversations, have all gone mainstream. And I think that these will just keep on happening to the point that in 3 to 5 years, it'll be like, just thinking that this was not the case before will be crazy, right? That is what I see happening right now in a nutshell.
I wonder if we can both jump into a time capsule and explore what a pathway beyond net zero looks like. Because if I remember rightly, so you found a Top Tier Impact with the mission to adopt sustainability more into the mainstream. I think that's one pathway. And I think that pathway needs to be like net zero. So like less bad behavior, which has a lot to do with changing the biggest companies and supply chains and standards and measurements and reporting. The other perspective would be more on like pushing the envelope towards what now has become another buzzword, but at least that I strongly believe in. How can we create business models that truly regenerate the health, the soil, the welfare, the ecosystems, on this emerging global civilization? And yeah, I'm really just curious where you're standing, both with your own positioning as well as where you see the market moving.
Yes, so regeneration, as you say, has become a massive buzzword. And yet I really see this net positive path as our future. if we truly are to advance, it just feels natural to contribute rather than extract. It's just natural. When you think about the way in which nature evolves as an entire ecosystem, the way that balance is perfectly preserved no matter what, and you think about, you know, this term that we use, like advanced civilization. So what's the advance? Like, how can we contribute, right? Like, I think that this is the next step. And when I think about more concretely, okay, so how is this going to happen out there? Well, first of all, we need to have extremely compelling and exciting examples of it. And this is where, for instance, like my TV series on Gaia, Road to Utopia, is going to show these lighthouses, is going to show examples of how this actually happens, and happens through an incredible business, a business that is truly making sense on all fronts and is proposing something new, right? Hey, I want to be on that boat too, right? Can I jump over to that boat? Like, that is what I think is the easiest and most compelling way to like bring over. It's not about, oh, that's bad and, you know, it's not good and we need to do it when we should do it this way. Forget about that. It all needs to come from a different way of operating. And so this is happening in parallel. And I am supporting it not just through Top Tier Impact, but as I said, also with these larger public sharing, such as this TV series. And then there is the part of, you know, the net zero work, for instance, that we do through ESG 360. That is the basis to then say, hey, we've got our stuff together. We've got the data. We finally understand what we never understood before. Now we can do more than that. We can do more than net zero. And we are empowered and educated to understand how we could, for instance, be regenerative as a business that never even knew what that concept means or thought about it for a second. So really, it is about laying those steps for them to walk towards that.
So the picture that comes to mind and the word that you have been mentioning is like parallel tracks. I think this is where I very much resonate with you. So what comes into my consciousness is like more mainstream adoption, net zero, and in parallel both spreading the stories, but also, yeah, creating the acupuncture points to push the envelope to go beyond net zero. I'm curious if you have from your own network a couple of exciting examples to share where you think companies are already, let's say, going beyond net zero and into regeneration?
So there are startups for sure, and that's a whole little ecosystem to explore. You know, it's actually not just for the way I see regeneration is not just, oh, regeneration is an area. It's more like regeneration is an enabler, just like a technology like AI is an enabler, or sorry, not regeneration, but like sustainability would be something that goes anyway. It's the same with regeneration, right? So we see startups at the intersection of regeneration and farming, regeneration and Web3, right? Regeneration in so many different areas. Like, you can really apply it as a mindset. The examples of companies that you're asking, I have to say, I am yet to come across a case study that I can legitimately say and be confident to put out there and say that they're doing it, because you know what? Let me tell you, there are a lot of companies out there that are claiming it. They are not actually doing it. So I'm just not comfortable with mentioning any of those, because everything I've looked at is not regeneration.
Thanks. I agree. To compare it with a metaphor from gardening, I think what we basically now know and come to grips with is, like, let's say, the old world that is obviously crumbling, that has few decades left to move towards net zero, and completely new ways to reimagine how do we do business and how do we actually really create resilient companies and ecosystems for regeneration. Nevertheless, if not companies, do you have some seedlings, some initiatives, some things that excite you in the regenerative space?
Absolutely. So, for instance, here on this island of Ibiza, where I'm in, there are farming projects, such as one called Juntos Farm. They're really looking at not just the regeneration of the soil, but really how the community comes together in enabling these, 0 kilometer of delivery, in enabling this, hey, if I don't have it, you have it. Like, let's make sure that we're all collaborating together, right? So it's not just the adoption of all the practices that means we are treating soils and produce in a regenerative way, but also we are enabling everybody to move towards that goal together, right? So that I mentioned this the other day to someone who found it really funny. So I like to tell my team sometimes 1 + 1 = 3. So confusing mathematics, but this is my favorite way of saying how we can create synergies. And so I think for projects like them to have this synergetic approach, right? Not just, hey, here is how we're bringing regeneration into the equation, and also here is how we are enabling our surrounding ecosystem to be part of that same journey, because that enhances everybody.
If you allow, because I know you've been sitting on many panels, I also have done a couple of podcasts specifically on the intersection of Web3 and sustainability. And before we dive into it, I want to share the context from my own perspective. For me, Web3 and distributed ledger technology is super interesting. I personally think that somewhat 98% of it is really just pretty much bullshit and Ponzi schemes. I was with 99%, so I feel I'm becoming a little more inclusive with ditching 98%.
Okay.
So I wonder, especially when it comes to transparency, new governance structures, radical inclusion, bottom of the pyramid projects, where do you see your own ecosystem interfacing with Web3 technology? And what are the couple of examples that maybe beyond the seedling stage do you think are exciting?
Yeah, well, what you just shared, I have been sharing for years. So I think we're just on the same page, on the fact that 99+% of things, unfortunately, are hot air, still are today and have been in the past. And, it's over cycle and cycle of Web3 is shown. I think it is, if we take responsibility for this, it is a reflection of our level of consciousness in general, that a technology with such great potential for collaborative governance designs and new ways of organizing together as humans has defaulted more in the dystopian rather than the utopian direction. But leaving all of that aside, how have we related to it? Well, look, I first came across blockchain technology and Web3 in 2012 because of my background in governance design. I did get excited about it, but I've also stayed very realistic over the years in what is usable and achievable, UX, UI, education, and everything else along the way. So I looked at using it multiple times at top tier impact and never implemented it, simply because I want top tier impact to be straightforward, easy to use, like inclusive, intuitive, So, I mean, we are super simple in the sense that we are on native communication platforms. Like that's just how we do things. And if there was something in Web3 that I deemed to be like that, fantastic, right? Like I would go for it. And I could definitely benefit from these governance mechanisms for people to feel more empowered and part of a community, but part of a community as in, with their voice, with their voting power, with like things being organized together, right? In a way that aligns incentives. I love that. And so it has been with a heavy heart that a couple of times when I looked at doing this, also because of the amount of activity at TTI and things going on, thinking like, it'd be so great to have this to tidy it up and make it easy for everybody, including us. It was just not possible. And so I don't know when it's going to be.
So it's interesting how you gave the answer. Let me try to be more specific, because I think you gave the answer about adoption of Web3 technology for your own ecosystems, which is, I think, one direction. The other thing is more from, if you say 99.9%, what are the 0.1% where you really think distributed ledger technology, at least in a seedling stage, makes a difference, deserves the attention, deserves to attract more investing, and where do you say like the ripple effects, ultimately the systemic change effects taking place?
Okay, so let me go straight into another controversial topic that I think deserves clarifications: carbon offsets. To me, there is massive corruption, lack of clarity, and BS in the carbon offset space. Now, let's just start with the fact that in itself, carbon offsets are, in my view, how they're perceived today, a flawed concept. Because how is it that we're just supposed to be taxed and then still behave badly rather than fixing things at the core? So I already find that that has a structural issue to start with. Second part is obviously that if we leave that to the side, then we go into how this process concretely happens. Endless examples we get told of pretty much every week about corruption, about things not existing, about, all kinds of stuff. Now, the way that I look at that space is a little bit reversed. So I will address how I think that these can make sense. Now, these to me make sense when you think about nature as these incredibly valuable assets. Like, we've been doing that with gold. We've been doing this with bits more recently, right, in the Web3 space. And yet we all need to agree inherently there is something there, right? Like, we're trusting there is something there. Nature, there is no question about the value and the rapidly increasing value of it in this world we live in. And so from my perspective, because I know that some people get polarized about, well, why do we need to price nature into the equation? Well, we have not been pricing it, and now you can look at the consequences of that. So yeah, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to price it because it's obvious at a consciousness level the value of this. Unfortunately, we're not in that world yet, right? So it's better than nothing to approach it in a positive way. So rather than a negative externality, hey, let's fix these negative externalities with some taxes that can be manifested with carbon offsets, more like a positive externality with positive intrinsic and growing value as an asset, right? So I see companies such as the Intrinsic Exchange based in the US that are looking at bringing also normal classes of investors and publicly traded structures into this equation and approach it differently, right? So move away from these taxing carbon offset mindset to that. And this is where I think that this technology is extremely helpful. Now, why it's helpful? The basic reason is obviously because there is all this lack of transparency, there is all this corruption taking place. Absolutely ridiculous, right? Given the reason why this exists in the first place. So there is such an important use case. And there is an active market. And yet, everything I have seen, so now this is an example of like where it's needed, but now let me get to the fact that the things that I have seen being done in this space have actually been disappointing. And I can't really pinpoint if it's because they didn't really dare to go to the point where, these property of traceability, transparency can truly be owned and implemented, right? And when I say daring, as in daring that the business model and the market will absorb this positively. So I don't know if that is one of the reasons or there are other reasons for it, but this is an area where I do still see a big gap. And a big, to your question, like 0.1% of truly making sense and truly potentially, helping with something that needs to be fixed.
I think the overall tonality of the podcast has been very critical. So what are signs of hope?
Well, I think your questions have definitely gotten us there. But in terms of signs of hope, I think it's always the other side of the coin. It's always the other side of the coin, because when we think about what I just told you right now and the criticism about what's happening, on the flip side, I have never seen more funds, for instance, like being raised for reforestation and restoration. I haven't seen projects like the Intrinsic Exchange until recently. Like there's just so many people coming into the space with the right intentions, because, at the end of the day, technology or tools and capital are, so to say, neutral in the sense that it depends on the intentions of the humans that are leveraging them. And so in a way, for everything we talked about today, Alistair, there's another side of the coin. So let's talk about corporates and net zero as well. At this point in time, we have never had before this public push that is not just happening from normal people and the press, is happening from regulation saying, guys, all of you publicly listed companies, now recently privately owned companies, whether you like it or not, here's what you got to do. And here the penny drops, because what needs to be done is a lot, is very onerous, right? So for what relates to climate sustainability, not yet regeneration, but at least this part. So it's incredible for me to witness that, right? And go like, whoa, this is really happening. And guess what? Like, if I have to sort of like step back and look at the pace of it is so intense. We can't ask for more, even though we would want it to be even faster, right? We're all like, hey, we're running out of time. This needs to happen yesterday. But realistically speaking, in a pragmatic way, regulation has become so intense that it's like, wow, we need to approach this step by step and not panic, right? And do it gradually, because that's what's feasible, at least today. And for me, that's extremely exciting as well, right? It's exciting to see it happen. It's exciting to see that ecosystem that continues to evolve. And I really want to do this exercise by taking the specific things that we talked about. So maybe you tell me like how we can approach the flip side of any of the topics we brought up today. But another one that I want to mention is like really like zooming into the well-being space and seeing how common it has become, even with funds that are general impact funds, that until a few years ago, they would tell us, hey, areas like psychedelics, we'd love to support, but it's not okay for our LPs. It's not okay for like the image of the fund. That has changed just in the last 18 months, right? And it keeps on changing. And all these discussions, and even like people that this is more anecdotal, but I came across someone who's been doing like a big experiment around psychedelics with some universities, but because of like his position in the public opinion and involvement and so on, has not been able to talk about it publicly, and now is, and now will soon do so. So there are a lot of these examples on the well-being side of things that are just rocking the boat, but also showing the acceptance, how we've all talked about these one way or the other. I still remember that in May 2022, in Davos, we were hosting some impact events, and there was one on psychedelics, and I really shared openly like my experiences as well, and several people still came up and said, wow, incredible that you would share it. And I think now if I was in the same situation, I wouldn't even hear that, right? Because it would be like, yeah, of course we're talking about it. Why not? So yeah, so the signs are all there. Like everything, we live in a duality-based world. Like there is flip sides to each single topic here.
Yeah, I wonder if instead of flip sides, I see it more on a spectrum. So people that watch the video can see me trying to draw the spectrum. The others have to close their eyes, maybe, if you're not driving when you're listening to the podcast. So I see on, let's say, one side of the spectrum, I see singularity, techno, utopianism. Basically people that saying, yeah, well, we will leapfrog, it will somehow pan out, technology has always accelerated and made radical changes. On the other side of the spectrum, I see podcasts and discussions that basically say, well, we don't even have the hydrocarbons to mine the minerals to make the transition possible. So that's kind of the emotional spectrum that I hold. And I agree with you that on a public discourse level, a lot has changed, not only in the last 10 years, but much like you said, just in the last 2 years. So basically speaking about psychedelic experiences is not like off the charts impossible. It's more like you say, even more mainstream funds are now approaching to invest into, let's say, innovative approaches to mental health, mental healing, psychedelics, traditional plant medicines, and so forth. So I wonder, instead of, I mean, I like this flipping the coin and, you know, showing some positive examples. Where do you personally, really as the human being, Alessa, see your side on the spectrum?
Yeah, I really like this spectrum you drew, Alistair, and I think about it. So I used to be closer to the techno-utopian side of things, including when I started TTI. I have to say that because of speaking with climate scientists pretty much every week, geopolitical experts, and all of that, has been a medium to long-term cold shower in the past couple of years for me. So I have to say I am a bit closer to the other side of the spectrum right now than the techno-utopian side. However, with that said, it's still a little bit like, you know, the way that I describe it, I think this is an important thing for me to incorporate into consciousness. I could choose to not get as much of that information that I currently get, you know, from experts in various areas, but I do like to do it because it's my own practice and exercise to process the feelings that arise within me from that. And then after doing that, choose how I show up and what I want to go for, stand for, and experience, right? So I still, you know, after doing that, go and explore things that they're not necessarily just on the techno-utopian side of things, because it's also not my background. Like I'm not a, say, fusion founder, right? So this is not that. I do support companies in these areas, whether it's, you know, top tier impact activities, visibilities. We will talk about some of these topics in the TV series too. So there is overlap, but definitely not in terms of like my specific activities. Although I would say that my specific activities have a little bit of that mixed with more sort of like present day structure level activities. So what I mean is, you know, okay, what in the context of the regulation of today, right? These platform and these SaaS technology can really accelerate what we want to see being done, right? So I guess that my to summarize my answer is like I have shifted on that spectrum. I like the how it's drawn, and yet even though I am closer to the other side of the spectrum, I then choose how to go about things, because obviously it's also not going to help us if we just stay hanging out on the full other side of the spectrum, complaining about how things are. So yeah, that's where I stand, I guess.
So let's move towards the last part of the podcast. And I want to share a dream, because I don't know, you know, ever since I met you, I have the feeling I can bring that up. That dream I received that dream or that vision somewhat 8 to 9 years ago in a deep series of ayahuasca retreats. And I saw us as humanity somewhat maybe 500 years in the future as an interplanetary civilization, and having healed the many wounds that we inflicted on the mother organism, but not in a retro-romantic sense that we suddenly now all are permaculture farmers, but that we made wise sense of AI, robotics, and so forth, including, like I said, starting to populate the Milky Way and start interfacing with other interplanetary species. So if that's not too crazy for you, I would like you to pick, we can stay on the meta level first. What do you think are the crucial building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead? If you were to look at your own legacy that you leave behind, unless you get immortal, let's say Alessa will, I don't know, have 120 years on this planet in this body or something like that, or 95 or something like that. From a legacy perspective, what you want to leave behind, what are the crucial building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead? And what's your role in that?
Planetary, you mean multi-planetary, yeah?
We can stay with I'm happy for you to answer that from a multiplanetary perspective.
Yeah.
We can also see it more from us as a species growing up with nation states to ultimately coming to grips.
I think they're all parts of the same. So we may as well, for illustrative purposes as well, we may as well talk about multiplanetary. Now, I wrote a poem about this a few years ago. I like to write short stories, like rhyme stories about these kind of topics. Happy to read that too, because it does summarize a few things, but just a specific, it summarizes through a intense story, the consequences of, I guess, not approaching these building blocks in a certain way. And so let me get to something, and then, we can go and read that or whatever. Also, it is something like 4 or 5 minutes. So just FYI, 4 or 5 minutes long. One of the core building blocks, in my view, is being able to play these infinite rather than finite games. So exporting this finite game that we are currently playing in our economic paradigm to other planets only means a finite horizon. Mine this planet, extract from this planet, next one. Makes absolutely no sense. Also, in my view, and I will stop there so that, you don't tell me, hey, we're going a bit too far out in here. But I do believe that there are balance mechanisms in the wider universe, or let's say other more advanced forms of awareness and consciousness that look at that, and look at keeping a balance that includes this sort of like regenerative, infinite type of approach to how things are being done. And so for me, a core building block is this, moving to infinite games rather than finite ones. Like concretely, we've been talking about it most of this podcast. Regeneration is the core one. I could go into a lot of other pieces, but I'll just stop here and check with you.
No, you're not scaring me. I precisely think before being able to play in an infinite game and an interplanetary game, we better make sure that within the planetary boundaries, we close the loops, get the plastic out of the oceans, making sure what do we do with like highly toxic nuclear waste and so forth. And then I personally don't see any boundaries, literally, from interplanetary to interdimensional, whatever. We can go like pretty far out there. So the question is more for you, what would be the feeling, what would be the excitement, what would be the emotion with which we want to leave the listeners?
Beautiful. I think, when I tap into this last question more, and I think about it, like what comes through is also this collective consciousness. And this collective consciousness, not necessarily being this abstract, feeling and whatever it is, and maybe I experienced it in some journey or whatever. It's actually more really bridging each other's perspectives with compassion and with a constant effort of understanding each other. I think it's something that can get us all, whether it's like, in the public arena or in day-to-day context, get us such a long way. Now, I'll say a tiny random example that yesterday there was this group of ants that somehow we had a drop of honey like somewhere in the house, and here in Spain with the climate, like, living in the countryside, there's like all sorts of little animals. But I was just observing how these ants picked up the signal and organized themselves. And, I was thinking, we have very little, because I looked it up as well. And I'm like, very, very little understanding of how all of this actually happens, right? For a species that is right here, everywhere. So I really think that, without going into, hey, here is the laundry list of things that we need in order to have this regenerative loop and so on, just these bridging the gap and tapping into that collective feeling like, hey, we're in this together. We are all on this same rock together, and tapping into that, not just in the special moments or the circle and the ritual, but really like as a practice, day in, day out, or especially through tough moments, tough feelings, tough experiences. always gets us a long way. I can definitely say so for myself.
I agree on the emotion, but I have the feeling I want to at least try. So building blocks for me are like radical redistribution, intergenerational trauma healing, certainly in very different ways, giving people access to what I would call the sacred testaments of unity consciousness, usually packaged in psychedelics, but also accessible through other meditation techniques. I also did a podcast on my own darkness retreat experience. Another one is really radically rethinking the way we're stewarding intergenerational wealth and coming up with smart asset classes that really make a difference on a very longitudinal effect. Just when we see that the maximum of biodiversity in forests is often only reached after a couple of 100 years, so far we do not even have the asset classes that are able to deploy capital into such formats. Another one is definitely smart ways where a lot of these beautiful initiatives in the cultural quadrant, so to say, find the interstitial tissue to really interoperate. I think Hilo is not too bad of an example that I'm aware of, that are able to interlink like thousands of communities, all the way up, all the way down. Also maybe a thing that you could consider for top tier impact or ESG 360. So these were now many examples from my side, and I don't feel they're just like empty hashtags, because I've been exploring them now, for more than a decade, more than a couple of decades, actually. So I wonder if you were to pick your own involvement, your own legacy, and where do you want to leave an imprint on this beautiful planet called Earth? What are the building blocks that are very close to your heart and that you want to see like ripening and flourishing in your lifetime?
Such a good question, Alistair. And you know what? As you were just asking this last question and I reflect about it, I feel it's been moving and changing for me, actually, in the sense that it started much more in the asset class and regenerative side of things. So talking about asset classes, as you know, the current forms of equity that we have been around for 500, 600 years, throughout which we have had only more and more concentration. So the data points on how this is flawed and what it has led to in terms of inequality are right there. And ironically, they have accelerated for various reasons in the last few years. So that is something that I explored a lot a few years ago, also when I was looking still more at specific projects and initiatives within Web3. And so that's one that's been there, followed by regeneration, actually. I feel it's shifting right now, and I feel it's shifting in a direction that possibly relates more to well-being and and our beings themselves, but not necessarily at the level of here is how we dive in and take care of intergenerational trauma in a way that is informed by various different practices, almost at the levels that might again relate to this current reality, day-to-day systems, how we operate and all of that. So I cannot tell you what this is right now, because I think it's shifting. Yeah.
Instead of asking you a question, finishing the podcast, what? Wow, I have to cut this out. Wow.
Okay.
Wow, nicht stören. I'm so sorry. Wait, this has never ever happened. Wow. Wow, I didn't have one integration. It was my mom. My grandma is about to die. Anyhow, I will have my team cut that out. Alessa, instead of asking you a final question, what would be almost like a sharing from your heart? What would you like to give away from this beautiful, deep conversation to the listeners. Where can they make a difference? Where can they find their ikigai? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good question, I guess, because there is still a question in there for the sharing. And you know, when I tune in, I really, the message that comes through is that we got this, and finding the courage of truly feeling into what that ikigai or what that calling is a vulnerable, raw, beautiful work that happens in some big moments, but also happens in the small moments. And the courage to really look at that is what I want to transmit, because I do believe that if we lived in a world where everybody can just be aligned with their dharma and have the space to express from there, to play from there, to create value from there, then everything else would take care of itself by default.
Thanks, Alessa, for the beautiful, deep conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alistair.